Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have David Bulova from the House of Delegates with us this morning. Good to see you, David.
Wonderful to see you again, Woody.
I understand that there's a very minor tax issue facing you this session as a result of some legislation from Capitol Hill.
Yeah, usually the idea of tax conformity, doing that at the very beginning of the session is one of our more mundane duties. And this year, of course, with the large changes at the federal level, it's kind of forced Virginia's hand to make tax policy changes at the state level. And so right now, if we don't do anything, and so we didn't do anything wrong, but because of that federal tax policy change, it means that Virginia will have about $600 million more in revenue each year. And so the General Assembly right now is trying to struggle with how to react and respond to that. One of the challenges is that the federal changes expire in tax year 2025. And so while we want to make some changes to our tax structure, we have to be very careful that we don't lock in something that is going to overcommit us past 2025.
Now, those are the changes for individuals versus corporations that expire in 2025.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly right. So we've got a couple different proposals on each side. For me, you got to step back and look at who's actually being affected at the state level with respect to those tax changes. And so the majority of people who will actually be paying more taxes are those who make under $50,000 per year. The next bucket are those who make between $50,000 and $125,000. And so the changes that we consider really have to take that into consideration. And quite frankly, there's a lot of good ideas out there. I like the idea of maybe a hybrid approach, like phasing in a earned income tax credit over time, but also raising our standard deduction in Virginia, which hasn't been touched in since 2009. And then, of course, again, making some strategic investments in our infrastructure, so broadband for rural areas, in education, in conservation and natural resources, I think makes a good sense.
So that earned income tax credit would be made fully refundable, as I understand it, or partially refundable. The governor wants it fully refundable. I think there are 26 states that do that now.
Right, and at the federal level, it's been a very effective way to help reward work. And so you're only eligible for that refundable earned income tax credit if you are actually a working family. And so it really incentivizes getting out there and having a job. At the same time, though, we don't want to put all of our eggs into one basket. And so you've got to recognize that those tax changes at the federal level affect both the lower income brackets, but also those middle income brackets. And in my area in particular, those middle income brackets, that's squarely middle class. And so we got to be cognizant that those individuals also struggle with very high mortgages, with college and other things that families deal with.
And of course, the standard deduction here in the Commonwealth is very, it pales in comparison, especially now, to what the federal government did recently.
Yeah, it's very, very low. And even without the changes at the federal level, it's probably high time that we revisited our standard deduction anyway.
Good news for the Commonwealth, especially Northern Virginia, with the announcement of the Amazon headquarters, co-headquarters there.
Right, right. Yeah, you know, I think we're excited that Amazon chose Virginia for its headquarters. I think it really gets at the strength of Virginia's economy, but the thing that I'm really proud of is that they chose us because of the quality of our education system. And so a lot of the incentives that we threw out there were to invest in our own infrastructure and to invest in our higher education, particularly when it comes to IT and computers and engineering, to ensure that there is a pipeline of workers for Amazon. And so that is exciting, you know, that we both get this great new corporate partner, but we also are investing in our own infrastructure and our own education. We certainly have some things we want to be concerned about. You know, traffic you want to be concerned about, housing affordability, all things that we need to consider. An interesting statistic, though, is that in Crystal City, we are actually really just replacing the capacity that we already had in there. And so with 25,000 new people coming in, most people don't realize that we lost more than that during sequestration and during BRAC.
BRAC was the Base Realignment
Advisory Commission, right.
Right.
And so they're the ones who kind of realigned the bases, and we had a lot of infrastructure in Crystal City that is now sitting vacant. And so we're just making sure that we're fully utilizing all those investments that we've made in that area.
So how has this recent federal government shutdown affected your constituents?
It's affected a lot of my constituents in a very personal way. You know, and we'd like to think that the federal government will hold true to being able to pay those individuals afterwards, but for many of them, it's a cash flow issue. If you don't have that income coming through, they're not able to pay the bills. They're not able to pay the college tuition. They're not able to go ahead and keep food on the table. And so I've got a lot of people in my community who are truly hurting as a result of what's happening at the federal level.
I take it it's also starting to have an impact on local retail, for example.
Yeah, certainly. You know, as people start to hunker down and tighten their belts, it's absolutely having an impact on our local economy and our local businesses.
And I assume you have not only federal employees, but people who contract with the federal government. And
right.
Unfortunately, those people aren't protected in terms of back pay.
Right, yeah, exactly right. And you know, the federal government over the years has relied more and more on those contractors, but they are a lifeblood of our economy, you know, especially in my district. And you're correct, is that you know, they are not held harmless, and it's going to have a permanent impact on those businesses and those families.
As usual, you have a very robust legislative agenda for your constituents, so let's talk a little bit about some of those. Let's start with pharmacy counseling.
Yeah, this is a bill that came out of a study from the Joint Commission on Healthcare, which is one of the commissions that I sit on. And the issue is relates to the opioid epidemic that Virginia is experiencing. And so where are those opioids coming from? And so oftentimes you'll have somebody who will have a prescription for opioids and they don't use the entire prescription. And in fact, a frightening statistic is that 2/3 of those prescriptions don't initially get used, and about 53% of that stays in the home, where either it can get used by the person who originally had the prescription, so they are basically self-medicating, or it becomes available to children and other members of the household. In fact, there's about 60,000 emergency room visits by children under 6 each year because of ingesting drugs at the home.
That many?
It's a very tragic amount. And so the Joint Commission on Healthcare was looking at how do you tackle this? And so one small piece is making sure that when a pharmacist counsels somebody when they get a new prescription, and by law they're required to counsel a person, that one of the things that they should discuss is how to properly dispose of medications. And so there's other things about drug interactions that I think most people are aware of, but we want to make sure that that pharmacist is also telling that person, look, here's the proper way to go ahead and dispose of these drugs if you don't go ahead and use the full amount.
Is there a statewide database that tracks the prescriptions that doctors provide to their patients, especially in terms of opioids, to avoid a patient going to Dr. A, and at some point Dr. A says, no, you've had too much.
Right.
They move to Dr. B.
Yeah, and that's a system that we've been working to put together over the last couple years, because you're right, that doctor shopping can spell a lot of trouble, and so you want to make sure that you see those red flags coming up. And I'll hand it to my colleagues, especially from Southwest Virginia, that's been hit hardest by this opioid epidemic, and they've been real leaders in helping to make sure that we got a system in place where, first of all, you've got doctors being educated on the impacts or potential impacts of prescriptions, and also to make sure that we've got the means in place to catch anybody who's trying to game the system.
We see more electric vehicles on the roads these days. I've seen some charging stations at Wawa's even.
Yeah.
What's happening on the state level?
Yeah, and so this is kind of exciting. And I love the idea of electric vehicles. I think there's a lot of promise, a lot of technology and entrepreneurship in that, but it'll never succeed if you don't have a network of charging stations. And so this is actually something that started back in 2011, I believe, under the McDonnell administration, where I sponsored a bill that allows for private entities to install fee-based charging stations. You can give away the electricity, but we know that not everybody's going to want to give away that electricity. But the problem is, once you sell electricity, you become a regulated utility under the State Corporation Commission, and not many people are going to be willing to do that. And so we essentially declared that if you were a private entity doing that, you weren't regulated. However, a lot of the places where charging stations, fee-based charging stations, have the most promise are on public property. And so state parks, when you think about colleges and universities, when you think about VDOT and all their infrastructure. And so this year we have put in a bill, and it's advancing through the system, to say that any state agency and any local agency can install a fee-based electric vehicle charging station as well.
Back to the opioid epidemic, I understand that there are a new group of synthetic drugs that have recently been developed, fentanyl, for example.
Yes.
And it poses some really serious problems in terms of overdoses, and it's really tough to keep up with the new technology, so to speak. How are we dealing with those issues?
Struggling as always, and I think this year we continue to have new bills that classify different types of drugs, particularly the synthetic ones you're talking about, as being illegal. But ultimately, we need to get ahead of the issue. We need to make sure that we're not over prescribing in the first place, because that tends to be the gateway towards heavier drugs, like fentanyl, and ensuring that if somebody does have an addiction problem, that it's not off to jail you go. It's how do we make sure that we give you the support and the services necessary to kick that addiction.
Speaking of new technologies, I think I saw a media report recently that at George Mason University now there are robots that are delivering pizzas to the students there.
Yeah. It's one of those exciting and frightening things at the same time. We've had conversations over the potential for drones, and so lots of potential commercial applications of that, but I think most people would be a little nervous about thinking about having hundreds of drones kind of going back and forth in their neighborhoods. And so how do you balance the commercial promise of that with privacy issues and the idea that they can be noisy, and you also have some safety issues involved as well. So but it's exciting that George Mason University is doing that, and I'm proud that George Mason is in my district, and is the epicenter for a lot of that kind of research.
What about funding for George Mason University and our institutions of higher learning, especially in relation to the needs of the Amazons of the world?
Yeah, and so again, neat thing about Amazon is that a lot of our commitment is that we actually put funding into our colleges and universities. This year, at the request of George Mason, I actually put in a budget amendment for some additional money for some computer science and IT staff. George Mason is one of these colleges that's really stepped up to the plate and grown. And so the last decade, they've added 9,000 new students. And so we got about 38,000 students on campus right now.
So they have the largest student body population in the state, I believe.
You bet. But that puts a lot of strain on your faculty and your staff. And so while it's exciting to do all this research, you also want to make sure that the student experience is a robust one, and that you have enough professors to engage and interact with those students. And so that's what that budget amendment that I put in does, is brings on more actual professors, so that you don't wind up with these auditoriums of 200 people and one professor. It's really important, especially with technology, to have those smaller classrooms where you can have that interactive contact.
Now, I know you work a lot with local governments, the county and other local governmental bodies, and of course the Commonwealth is a Dillon rule state.
Right.
Localities can only do what the legislature allows them to do, and there's been a continuing discussion and debate about the use of what's called proffers.
Right.
There was some controversy a few years ago about a bill that passed, and I know you have something to deal with that in terms of changing a few things at least.
Yeah, and so in the great world of land use that most people don't think about, but it's very important. So if you are zoned for a particular density, let's say you've got a lot and you can put 2 houses on there by right, you can always do that. Most developers, though, will want to come in and say, hey, I'd like to put 10 more townhouses in there, or I want to have mixed-use development. And of course that has impacts on your local community in terms of transportation, in terms of education infrastructure, parks, other services. And so the idea about proffers is that the locality and the developer will voluntarily negotiate a deal that works for both the developer and the locality and protects the community. A couple years ago, there were some changes to the proffer system that made it really tough to do that. And so it said, hey, you cannot accept or offer an unreasonable proffer. And if you accidentally did ask for an unreasonable proffer, it put the locality in a lot of legal jeopardy. And so what it forced our localities to do was kind of sit on their hands and say, all right, I'm afraid to discuss with you. You offer stuff to me, and I'll tell you when you've kind of hit the sweet spot. And so it has brought especially residential development to a halt in many localities. And so clearly that is an untenable position. And so this year, the Virginia Association of Counties and a lot of your localities, the development community, the realtors have been working really hard to fix some of those pieces of the bill that was passed a couple years ago, so that you can once again open up honest conversations between your local government and your developer. And ultimately, who wins is the local community, because that's what these proffers are all about, is making sure that you've got quality development that fits with your local community.
Chances of success for that initiative?
I think it's pretty good. I think there are some groups who wish it would go further. There are some parts that I wish would go further, quite frankly. But given the position that we're in, I'd rather take half a loaf rather than none, and I think it's important to show some forward momentum and the fact that there's been some good faith negotiating.
So is there a Senate analog to it?
There is a Senate analog to it, and so one of the things is that's always exciting about the General Assembly. You never know what the Senate's going to do, what the House is going to do, and we'll toss each other's versions over, and I wouldn't be surprised if it wound up in conference committee where those differences can be worked out.
Over the past several years, lots of discussion around student discipline, and I know you have some legislation dealing with that.
Yeah, and so we've had some very tough debates about student discipline in Virginia over the last couple of years, and the reason it's very hard is that for a lot of school systems, they've got one of two choices. And so if you've got a student who's acting out, who has disciplinary issues, they can either suspend the student, which you take a kid out of their a learning environment, and you usually just exacerbate the issues that cause the disciplinary problem in the first place. And so you lose your opportunity with that student. On the other hand, keeping a disruptive child in school, that's not good either, because you're going to have a negative impact on the learning environment of other students. The takeaway for me from those discussions was the importance of local school districts having alternative school programs for kids that have disciplinary issues. And so you do have some school districts that have very good programs. And so Fairfax County has an alternative program both at the elementary and the high school level. That's mostly on our dime. We pay for that. There's not much state funding involved, and so we understand that not every school district can do that, and that's been the big pushback over the last couple of years on similar proposals. And so what I did this year was come in with a bill that was very similar to what Delegate McQuinn introduced for the last 2 years. It says, hey, we have to develop this statewide network of alternative programs. School districts, you are required to do this, but we are going to have some state money in the pot. And so what we've done is made this part of the standards of quality. The Department of Environmental or the Department of Education would come up with kind of your standards for what these programs have to have as a minimum. And then we would have a cost-sharing mechanism. And that way, again, if we're truly serious about doing this, you got to be a true partnership. You got to make sure that both the state and the locality have skin in that game. And so that's what the bill does.
So how's the county done in terms of the local composite index? And if you don't mind, take a second and explain what that means to our audience.
So the local composite index is the formula by which the state's share of public education is distributed among school districts. And so when you think about it, you've got a pie of education funding. Part of that is going to be paid for by the localities, and then part of that is the state's responsibility under our Constitution. That is further divided based on something called the local composite index. And so that local composite index tries to measure a locality's ability to pay for its own education. And so it looks at, what revenue generating capacity do you have? What are the mix of your students? And so it's a very imperfect way of being able to distribute those funds. And so that's where a lot of consternation comes, is that you have school districts like ours, that have a lot of English as second language learners, a lot of different challenges out there, and yet on paper, we look, like we can generate a lot of revenue, even though, cost of living is so much higher in our area, and so those things aren't factored in there, and so there's always a constant debate over whether we should change that local composite index. I have no doubt that we should. The problem is that it creates winners and losers, and so it makes it really, really tough to go ahead and do that unless you're raising the entire ship. You've got to actually adequately fund your system, and then you can work on that composite index.
Of course, part of the governor's proposals in terms of budget priorities relates to resources for teachers, for example, nurses, psychiatrists, counselors. Is that a critical need in Fairfax County now, or are you able to handle that?
No, it's a very critical need. And so there's a couple parts of what the governor is proposing that are very, very important. So the raise in teacher salaries is crucial. There's a lot of different reasons why we have a teacher shortage crisis. One of them is the pay, and so we need to make sure that we are paying our teachers like the professionals that they are. The counselor part is also really important, and it was a recommendation of the Speaker's Blue Ribbon panel on school safety. And so counselors play a very critical role. If you have a student who's having emotional difficulties or is getting picked on or bullied or whatever, that counselor is that first line of defense to make sure that student is getting the resources that they need. And unfortunately, what's happened is that counselors have had everything under the sun dumped on them, and so they're doing 1,000,001 other things other than focusing on that. And you have this incredible ratio of student to teachers, and so the two proposals are, let's make sure that ratio is correct, and so 1 to 250, I believe, is what is being proposed. And then I think it was Delegate Landis put in a bill that said of those counselors, 80% of their work actually has to be related to the core responsibility of counseling. And so I think those two things are very, very important to make sure that our students get the supports that they need.
And of course, the school resource officers, which are an arm of law enforcement, have become an integral part of our school systems, and they tend, unfortunately, to treat incidents of acting out as criminal behavior.
Right, and so in Fairfax County, and I think this is the model for the rest of the state, they have worked out a very detailed agreement between the resource officers and the school district to make sure that there is a solid understanding of what are those roles and responsibilities, so there's not any kind of confusion about that. And I think you're going to see that kind of thing replicated across the state because they are an important part of the safety. But you also have to make sure that you realize these are kids. They sometimes do dumb things, and you need to treat them mostly as teachable events and not criminal offenses.
Any chance that the Equal Rights Amendment might be revived as a result of its failure in the subcommittee?
Yeah, who knows? Stranger things have happened with General Assembly sessions. The fact that it passed the Senate, I think that bodes well, and we'll see how the session pans out.
Several iterations of a constitutional amendment dealing with redistricting have been introduced, and of course, if nothing happens this year, there won't be either a bipartisan or nonpartisan commission to redraw lines.
Right, and to me, this is fundamental. A lot of the issues that I think people get very frustrated with respect to the way our government runs can be traced back to gerrymandering. And so I think it is very important that we take the politics out of gerrymandering and we really get back to the idea that, hey, we are looking for districts that are contiguous, we are looking for districts that respect communities of interest, and the only way to really do that is to have a constitutional amendment that takes it out of our hands and puts it in the hands of those who are really looking at what is redistricting all about. In the Senate, we do have a version that is passed. It's not the one that was advocated by One Virginia 2021, but I think it's a step forward. But this is the year to make it happen because as most folks may or may not know, you have to pass a constitutional amendment and in the exact same language back to back with an election in between. And so if we pass it this year, we got an election, we'll come back next year and pass it, and then it goes to the voters. But this is definitely the year that we need to take action.
And of course, if we don't take action, we'll wind up in the same place we are right now in federal district court. It was only 3 years ago, I believe, that the congressional lines were redrawn as a result of gerrymandering, and now we've got an order.
Right.
We have a map that's going to affect the House of Delegates in the upcoming November elections.
Yeah, and with regard to the House districts, those were held unconstitutional because they were racially packed. The courts have generally shied away from saying you can't gerrymander for political reasons, although that's still also wrong. I think the big difference is that we have a governor, because redistricting is a bill just like any other bill, and it will go to his desk. And I think Governor Northam is very serious about not signing anything that has been gerrymandered. And so that's kind of our backstop. But if we can't agree, you're correct. It ultimately winds up going to the courts. I'd rather design a system that works for Virginia rather than punting it to our court system.
Well, thank you for being here, Delegate David Bulova. Good luck the rest of the session.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.